listener production.
Hi, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. There have been calls for pill testing in Australia for years, and finally, in the last couple, we've had some progress. It's now legal in Queensland and the ACT, and we're seeing more trials roll out across the country at some of our biggest music festivals. But now that we're collecting this info, what happens to all that data?
If they're not aware that there's a general change in the drug market that might affect them, then they're just going to go on as usual. So part of the aim of really getting this information out there to a broader set of people is to increase awareness of current changes in drug markets so they can take actions to reduce harms themselves.
Why experts are calling for pill testing data to be shared more widely and who that will benefit is coming up in the second half of this episode. First, it is time for the headlines with Chris Spiru. It's Wednesday, February 19.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. And I can't believe it's only Wednesday. But anyway, there's relief across the country today after the Reserve Bank finally cut interest rates. But RBA Governor Michelle Bullock was quick to pour cold water over hopes of a trend.
I can't say one and done. What I can say is that we've done one, we've removed a bit of restrictiveness, we are still restrictive, and we are waiting for more evidence that we're getting inflation sustainably back in the band before we are willing to move again.
The RBA lowered the official cash rate for the first time since 2020 from 4.35% down to 4.1%. It means homeowners will save on their mortgage repayments. For context, the average mortgage in Australia is $666,000, and someone with a home loan that size can expect to save just over $100 a month. And if you want to check exactly how much you'll be saving on your particular mortgage, get in touch with your bank.
Yeah, so I guess the next question then is, what does the rate cut mean if you're in the market for a house? Well, it's a mixed picture because the bank might let you borrow a little bit more as a result of this cut, but it could also put new upward pressure on house prices, which is the last thing we need. Mm-hmm. And look, while it's not great news for people who have cash in the bank because a lower cash rate means lower interest on your savings. And we know renters have been among those bearing the brunt of interest rate rises passed on by landlords struggling to afford their own home loan repayments. Will they get rental relief? Well, there's definitely a chance, especially if you have a decent landlord, but it is far from a guarantee.
Yeah, one group who will be very, very pleased with this decision, Sash, is the Albanese government. And indeed, Treasurer Jim Chalmers was almost giddy with excitement following the announcement yesterday, Arvo.
We know that there is more work to do. We know that this is not the solution to every challenge that people are confronting in their household budgets, but it will help. It is a welcome step.
Labor swept to power in 2022 only to preside over years of cost of living pain, so they can't really make the argument that people have been better off financially under them. But this cut kind of lets them say, yes, the cost of living crisis has been tough, but it's been tough all over the world, and that's not really our fault. And now we're turning the corner and fixing it.
Yeah, well, that's Labor's best hope of escaping the fate of governments around the world that have been voted out in the years of high inflation and high prices. The US, the most recent example of that, we heard Donald Trump use the catch call, are you better off after 4 years of this particular Biden administration? And the answer for a lot of Americans was no, even though there's a lot of nuance to that. They said no, and they said, well, we're going to vote for a new man, newish, and see how that goes. So, will Anthony Albanese call the election? Look, it would be strange for him to not capitalise on this decision. It is the first new thing the government can talk about that's actually positive.
Yeah.
There's been, a lot of movement on things like hate crimes and everything like that, which is super important, but it's depressing and it's sad and it's shit. So, no matter how heavily caveated this decision is from the RBA, it is positive in a general sense because it shows that we're finally getting some relief. But the other question you might have listening to this could be around inflation and, does this signal that, my grocery prices are going to get cheaper? Look, the answer to that is, it's complicated, but really what we see is things can go up, but they rarely ever come back down. And it's similar with rental prices as well, is that they climb, and then they kind of stay there. You might get a little bit of relief from your individual landlord, but generally the trend will stay. They've climbed and that's now where they sit. But my yardstick is always a block of cheese. And because I buy a block of cheese nearly every week. My husband and I eat a lot of cheese. We're real dairy fiends. But look, we used to pay $8 for a block of tasty cheese. I think it's like 500 grams or whatever. It's $10.50 now, and it's just not going to get cheaper. It's going to stay the same price. It's climbed there and it's going to sit there. So it'll be years before our wages catch up to cover the crazy price hikes we experienced in 2023. So there is still a lot of pain for people. It's by no means over. We're not suddenly out of the cost of living crisis, but you can't deny that this is the first genuine feeling of relief a lot of people have had in a long time.
Changing pace now, a 61-year-old man has been charged with the online harassment of Weekend Briefing host Antoinette Lattouf. New South Wales police searched his home on the state's north coast yesterday morning, later charging him with using a carriage service to menace, harass or offend. It comes just days after evidence wrapped in Antoinette's unfair dismissal case against the ABC, where she revealed she had received a number of threats since being taken off air during her 5-day cover on ABC Radio Sydney back in 2023. And that was after sharing a Human Rights Watch post accusing Israel of using starvation as a tool of war. The man has been granted conditional bail and is set to appear in court early next month.
Antoinette took to socials yesterday explaining she had received a harassing and racially charged email that called for violence late last year. Obviously, this is alleged and this is going through the courts now. And she was prepared to block and delete him, something she's no stranger to, unfortunately. But feeling exhausted and frustrated, she reported it to police. And in this statement, Antoinette went on to say, if you're copping this abusive shit online, report it. You shouldn't have to put up with it, and we shouldn't normalise it.
Meantime, the Prime Minister has hit out again at anyone who engages in racist attacks after revelations 2 Muslim women were assaulted in separate incidents at a Melbourne shopping centre last week. One of the alleged victims was a 27-year-old pregnant woman who was slapped across the face and shoved to the ground, while the other victim, a 30-year-old childcare worker, was choked and had her hijab grabbed while on her lunch break. The person responsible has not yet been found. Victoria Police is continuing to investigate.
In a statement, Anthony Albanese said, no one deserves to feel unsafe in this country and no one should be attacked because of their religion or race. Peter Dutton has also condemned the attacks, the opposition leader calling it unacceptable and a disgrace, while Victorian Premier Jacinta Allen said there was no tolerance for evil hatred and Islamophobia in the state, and she said the state government was introducing amendments to its anti-hate laws to step up its response.
And an Aussie has made an incredible find at an op shop, claiming to have stumbled across an album of photos of a former PM from 1996. And before I tell you who it is, I'll let you have a little guess. Here is a clue.
Take me to the April sun in Cuba.
Whoa.
Yep, you got it. It is the one and only Scott Morrison. TikTok user Charlie Fu has posted herself flicking through the album overnight with the caption saying, Rockdale Salvo's coming through, Rockdale being a suburb in Sydney's south. These photos show a young Scott Morrison, aged 28 by my calculations, enjoying holidays in Port Douglas and the UK with his wife Jenny, including one snap of him apparently hungover on New Year's Day with a handwritten note claiming he'd indulged in one too many Guinnesses the night before. The video was posted 10 hours ago at the time of recording and already has more than 50,000 views. The Greens TikTok page has commented saying, sorry, what? Something we can both relate to this morning, Sash.
Yeah, look, I really enjoy this story. I enjoyed watching the video and seeing this person flicking through this album of ScoMo. But I'm just not convinced. Like, why would an op shop be selling a photo album full of images of someone else? I don't understand. I get when they sell a camera and it has film already in it, I'm like, that's fine. But like an album with someone else's pictures, why are you selling that? Look, I'm not saying this is faked, but I just have a healthy dose of skepticism. And we are recording this early in the morning, so I would have called the salvo if I could have to check whether they are aware of this and if they would sell an album with photos already in it. But what I could do at 4 a.m, was a quick Google, and apparently op shops can do this. They can sell these photo albums with images, but generally they'd check that there was no identifying info or very personal photos in the album before putting it on the shelf. Now, this to me would rate as pretty personal, given it's the former Prime Minister of Australia. But maybe a quick flip through and they might not have even realised it was him. Now, he did have a head of thick brown hair at the time. And, I mean, the ScoMo we know didn't have much hair. So maybe they just didn't recognise him.
Yeah, and when I first saw this TikTok, I was kind of like, I don't know who that is. I saw the picture, I saw the face, and then it all started to connect. I was like, oh my God, that is Scott Morrison. I mean, the only takeaway I take from this is looking at that video, looking at how amazing that album is structured. It just has Jenny written all over it. Like, it is so neat. It is so almost perfect that I just know Scotty. Scotty has had zero to no involvement in putting that work of art together.
Yeah, well, there was also a part in that album where it said, Jenny was sick, so we went out sightseeing today. Left his wife alone in the cold. It was like winter in the UK.
Very on brand. Very on brand.
Yeah, what a bit of fun. Hey, Chris, thank you so much. Next up, we are getting into our deep dive looking at pill testing. Not so much the act of it, but what happens to the data that we get from it.
Hey, it's Helen Smith here with this episode of The Briefing. Pill testing at music festivals isn't that new, where you can take your drugs to get them checked for potentially deadly substances. But where does that data go and who is legally entitled to it? Pill testing has taken massive leaps in the past couple of years, and since we last reported on it, there have been a few key milestones. It's been introduced permanently in the ACT and Queensland. In Victoria, trials launched at music festivals late last year and will expand to 4 more festivals in 2025, following a series of drug overdoses. And New South Wales announced that it will become the 4th jurisdiction to trial pill testing. But now experts are calling for the data and information that we get from this testing to be distributed more widely and for more effective drug alerts. Drug policy expert Associate Professor Monica Barratt from RMIT has analysed what other countries are doing with their data to see what our policymakers could be doing better. Monica, who's receiving the data from pill testing right now in Australia, and what are they doing with it?
So what we have seen in Australia in terms of where the information generated by drug checking or pill testing is released further than the individual coming in, because obviously every drug checking service is going to tell that information to the person who submits their substance. So, in our report, we're looking at what happens beyond that. How does the public find out more about what's in the drug supply, which could potentially change the way that people use drugs, hopefully to reduce overdoses as well if they happen to encounter a similar substance to one that's been tested in a drug checking service. So what we tend to see in Australia is alerts. So these are where there's a particularly high risk detection. A group might decide, look, we really need to get this out there to the general community. For example, there have been nitazines found in cocaine. This is a potentially deadly, and we have seen deaths in Australia in the last 12 months of people who had a line of cocaine, they're expecting a stimulant, they're opioid naive, and it actually was adulterated with these strong, very potent opioids, and people are literally dropping. So that's a really significant situation, and then that tends to create alerts.
Yeah, and I'll get into some of those drug alerts later and what we can do better there. But I wanted to ask about that first-hand personal data that you kind of talked about, like what you're told if you go and get something tested at a music festival. Where does that information go right now? Does it go to the police? Does it go to the government? When you test a drug and you're told, yep, it's MDMA, it's safe to take, or hey, it's got this in it, it's probably not safe to take, does that just stay at an individual personal level?
So that depends on the service and the service agreements with funders and those around them. But the first thing to say, and I guess to reassure anyone listening that might use a drug checking service or might be interested in using one, is the data is completely anonymous. You mentioned the police there. If police were to find out at an aggregate something about the drugs market, which they might do, it's still at a completely anonymous level. And this information that is generated through the chemical analysis of drugs in drug checking, it's not the sort of information that can be done as evidence for any kind of criminal activity. And because drug checking is for public health purposes and not for law enforcement purposes, it needs to be done much more quickly so that it can actually inform people's decisions on the ground, ideally that same day within a couple of hours or less to that person. So, but yeah, I haven't fully answered your question. Again, it kind of goes back to the different services. So what they're doing at the moment, I guess what we finding out in this report that we did, reviewing everything that's currently going on, I feel like there's more capacity for the drug checking services in Australia to, be able to get that data out to the public as soon as possible. But, there's discussions to be had about the pros and cons of the different ways of doing that.
Yeah, so what are some of the benefits of sharing data collected from pill testing more widely?
So there's only a certain proportion of people that will ever be served by a drug checking service. So even working at capacity at a festival, you might be able to see 100, maybe 200 people per day. You might be able to test a couple of hundred samples per day. And we know there are millions of people using drugs every day in Australia. So obviously we can increase the capacity of drug checking services, and ideally people would personally access them, but not everyone is going to be able to do that. It's not practical. So particularly if there's a specifically dangerous substance that's detected, being able to put that information out more broadly, it could potentially reach many hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people, then the same benefits we expect from drug checking could occur at that broader level, where someone is made aware that potentially the cocaine that they're used to and maybe you've never had too much of a problem with, that at the moment there's actually some nitazene going around in cocaine. And then there needs to be some actions they can take, because it's one thing to say that, and then if people are just generally scared, that's not very helpful. So having some then further actions, like what can we now do? Maybe people will go out and buy reagent test kits, which do have some utility. They can determine whether something does or does not contain a substance. That can help them if they're not able to access a drug checking service. But if they're not aware that there's a general change in the drug market that might affect them, then they're just going to go on as usual. So part of the aim of really getting this information out there to a broader set of people is to increase awareness of current changes in drug markets so they can take actions to reduce harms themselves.
What are some ways that we can make drug alerts or the communication about what's in these drugs that could be tested? What are some ways we can make that better to increase awareness?
Well, one of the things we noted in this report is that people have very different information needs. So we want to be able to meet people where they're at. And some people want a very small amount of information, that they don't really have a lot of bandwidth for heaps and heaps of info. Whereas other people are the opposite. They feel a bit cheated by these itty-bitty small pieces of info and actually want more info, and they want to be able to play with it and see it and spend time with it. And there's everyone in between. So I think one of the findings from our report, which, is based on reviewing literature, talking to drug checking services, but also consultations and workshops with people who use drugs in Victoria. So, I think what that means is that we can create the same information in different formats to meet those needs. So, might be that at the start of a website you enter and you say, this is the kind of person I am. I just want a quick fix of information. I don't, want all the fluff. And then they press that button and then that's what they get. Or alternatively, you can choose, actually, this is the kind of information person I am, and then you go into that version. And I think at the moment we don't really have that so much.
And where are these alerts popping up? Because I'm just thinking of my general knowledge. I haven't seen really an alert in a while. Are they coming to me on social media, or are they going through mainstream media? Are they on the news?
So I think this is one of the problem, is the people that are hooked into the alerts are seeing lots of the alerts. But for those who are not, which is probably most people, they're probably not seeing them. I think in COVID, a lot of people who wouldn't normally follow the accounts of state government departments of health started to follow those accounts because they were putting out important information every day. Those accounts do publish the alerts, but in quite a formal way, and then they're repackaged up with additional information and perhaps in a less formal way, say on Instagram by harm reduction organisations, and those then reach a different group. But again, that group is not as wide as it could be. When drug checking is at a festival, then naturally, if there's an alert, an on-site alert makes sense. So that's quite a different situation. You can have, like a geo-fenced text message that goes out to, every mobile phone in the area. That's potentially one way of reaching many more people. And of course, you can just put up signs and posters. For example, posters on the back of toilet doors. People tend to spend, 30 seconds to a minute sort of staring at the back of the door. So that's one way you can reach them. And we've even had situations in Australia that I'm aware of where the DJ has literally stopped the songs and said, we've got a problem on site, and explained it and then started up again. So that happened, I think, in Sydney last year. There are different ways in which you can reach a bounded group like a festival, but it's a little bit more diffuse and harder, I think, when you're trying to reach the broader community. And I mentioned earlier there are pros and cons. One of the potential negatives if mainstream media picks up on some of these alerts is that it sort of further stigmatises or leads to further stigmatising experiences for people who use drugs, because sometimes the mainstream media, maybe not sometimes, maybe often, will just produce this person who uses drugs in a way that is negative or stigmatising rather than in a non-judgmental and respectful way. So that is one of the negatives that was brought up in the workshops of having greater visibility of this information, is it might then lead to greater visibility of negative stereotypes of people who use drugs. We do have to be aware of this and perhaps actively push positive ways of speaking about drug use.
Yeah, I guess it's about just finding that balance that, doesn't stereotype people taking drugs and doesn't paint a fear-mongering picture in a way that might deter people from looking for those updates or checking out for their own safety. Now, one other thing with this data, if it was shared more publicly and people knew, what was in what and where it was coming from, is there a possibility that people would go searching for the best drugs or the best cocaine to take, leading into kind of a drug shopping?
So I think the first thing to say is that most people who use drugs, or maybe even all of them, are already searching for the best deal and are ideally hoping that the drugs they purchase are not adulterated, are as they say they are. Of course, the information that we're able to put out as a drug checking service isn't going to necessarily relate to the drug that is in the hand of or that is about to be sold to someone. There's no guarantees there. It's much more general in nature. And sometimes where it is more specific would be if there's a pill stamp, a particular pill stamp that's being discussed, for example, that's been tested recently at a drug checking service, this particular pill, this is this colour, this particular brand. Now, the caveat that we have to always say, because it's true, is that firstly, even within batches, things can be variable. So even within the same batch, there might be some variation. There usually is variation amongst, say, proportion of MDMA per batch. And then the second thing is there are copycat pills. People do have similar presses, and that can happen too. So it's not like we, in putting this information out, will be able to be used in that very specific way. But I think what it does is it helps people's general understanding of what's going in drug markets. So they're going to be more aware that there is the possibility that nitazene could be in their cocaine, that there is the possibility that some MDMA pills contain something completely different because they've seen that recently in drug checking data this was the case, rather than them knowing exactly what's going to be in their substances. And, that then starts a conversation around, how close are we getting here to regulated supply? So, legal supply, because that's really the only way that someone would be able to purchase something and know exactly what it contains at the time of purchase would be if it was legally regulated, which it isn't currently.
Now, we've mentioned there have been a lot of milestones reached with pill testing within the last year especially. Do we think that we're getting everything out of the trials that are happening across the country right now?
I mean, there's always room for improvement with these things. Being able to offer this service to more people. We have millions of people in Australia taking some kind of illegal substance, and the proportion of those people that have had that substance tested at a drug checking service is going to be relatively low. So part of the issue that we have, if we look around in the ACT, Queensland, and then in Victoria, is capacity. So, the ACT service is open 2 days a week for a few hours per day. The Queensland services are open, there's 2 of them, and they're open 1 day a week for 1 afternoon. So that's pretty low capacity. We also know there are people who don't feel comfortable physically coming in to a service and would prefer to mail or otherwise get their substances maybe through a drop-off box tested and get that information remotely, either through a website or a phone call. And there's various reasons why those people feel that way. It can be concern around law enforcement, maybe feeling like they might be followed, or, disability, or they've got a full-time job, or family commitments. So many reasons why people might not be able to make it in, or the locality, they're located regionally. So if you think about that demand that we're not meeting, I guess that would be one of my desires in the future, is that we're, over the whole of Australia, able to meet more of the demand for this service. And essentially that just involves additional funding, additional sites.
Monica, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thanks, Helen.
That was Dr. Monica Barratt from RMIT, and 2025 will be a vital year for the progress of pill testing in Australia. So it's definitely going to be one to watch to see if these trials actually become permanent in Victoria and New South Wales. But that's it for this episode of The Briefing. Before you go, though, if you could share this app with someone else you think might enjoy it too, that would be great. It really does keep us making the content that you love. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, and on TikTok and YouTube, just search for Listener Newsroom. I'm Helen Smith. See you next time.
Listener.